You might think a cheaper phone like the Pixel 8a wouldn't stand a chance against the 10 Pro, what with its extra and superior camera sensors. But my previous video showed that the 8a's main camera lens can sometimes beat the 10 Pro's, either through sheer megapixel might or maybe just more mature software support. But now I turn to the other camera tests, starting with the wide angle. And this should be an easy win for the 10 Pro, what with its higher resolution and larger sensor. I understand that wide angle isn't quite as important as the main sensor is, and it wasn't even standard on cheaper phones until more recently, so simply having some sort of wide angle on the 8A, even if it's a rubbish sensor, still enables a lot of extra photographing opportunities that simply weren't possible before, like this toilet example here. If you really wanted to grab a pic of this before, then you'd have missed out on so many beautiful details, like the roll holder on the wall or my piss stain on the ground, or you get the idea. The 8a's wide-angle lens is interesting though, because it's the same as what's seen in the newer 9A model and the regular 10 phone, minus the PD quad thing. I'm not sure how that works on the 13 megapixel lens, but okay. So even if the 8A sucks ass at wide angle, it's not outdated because even newer and more expensive phones suck ass just as much. So come on 8A, do your best. You're representing the budget line of pixels here. So yeah, let's compare the two and see how they do. Now the first thing I want to point out is the colour of these traffic lights. Both of these look correct, don't they? So that's an improvement over the main lens, where with the 10 Pro, for some reason it makes it appear a dark red colour. I think there's something wrong with the HDR processing on the 10 Pro's main camera, but it doesn't seem to be a problem with the wide angle. So I like the results of both of these cameras here. The amount of grain is quite comparable. The readability of text is quite comparable. Yeah, I would say that this is almost like a draw. Maybe a little bit more detail on the tarmac on the 10 Pro. A bit less JPEGing. Yeah, quite comparable. So here's a very different sort of comparison. This was indoors in quite low light, and the first thing that stands out is just how differently it processes these colours. Now this wasn't just one colour, this was flashing between blue and red and green very quickly, and I honestly couldn't tell you which one is more faithful to how it actually was here. What I am going to look at is the amount of grain, especially in the corner of the images. The amount of detail is quite comparable, so the 8A's inferior sensor is actually holding up very well here. The 10 Pro makes it easier to read all the writing on all these billboards and stuff here, while the 8A, for whatever reason, is just a mushy mess. 10 Pro is definitely better there. The chipboard is a bit of a trade-off. Looks like some of the finer details are lost in the 8A, but then there are some more artifacts seen here on the 10 Pro. I'd say in this example though, the 10 Pro does pull ahead of the 8A, probably because the light isn't quite so good. Now I did this wide angle just to see how much detail is retained at a distance, so let's zoom in and have a look. The 10 Pro's result is sharper, although I can't make out many more details on this that aren't actually there on the 8A's. A little bit more detail on the distant wall, a bit sharp around the edges of the cars. Overall, the 8A might have an inferior sensor, but it's doing a very good job here. I realise I've neglected foliage in my comparisons so far, so here's a tree, and they both look sort of like a tree. I'm not going to give the win to either camera here, but I will point out that there is more dithering, again, going on the 10 Pro's example. So that could be a possible win for the 8A here. Now I know a lot of the examples I've used so far have been very industrialized, so here's another industrialized one, but with some more nature to it. The HDR in the Pixel 10 Pro seems better. That's just a color, but I'm looking at the ski slope here, and you can make out a bit of the writing here, whereas you can't see anything there. More detail here as well, whereas the 8A's is a bit washed out. Here it looks like the 10 Pro's is slightly out of focus though, so that's not good. Whereas down here, I feel like the 8A's more out of focus. Oh, I don't know. They're both pretty good wide-angle images, but I do prefer the 10 Pro's. Maybe this one's got a slightly dirty lens. I don't want to have to walk out there again. Honestly, we've only done a few comparisons, but I think I'm ready to make a conclusion about wide-angle lenses in good light. And it's that they're quite comparable. Even if the 8A sensor is much smaller and much lower in resolution, it holds up really well under these sort of situations. And I think I prefer the result because it's slightly less artifacty than the 10 Pro's is, especially around the corners where you can see a lot more dithering on the 10 Pro's example. Whereas the 8A might be a bit mushier, but I prefer it. But now we'll move to lower light situations, and this is where the 10 Pro will really begin to pull ahead. Now we're moving into low light, you can see that immediately the 10 Pro pulls well ahead. The 8A's is just reduced to a mushy mess, looks really low res and soft. whereas the 10 Pro can still make out all the details, even if they are a little bit blobby in nature, but definitely a lot better. I was pointing out in my main sensor comparison that I thought the 8As looked greener overall, but here it's the 10 Pro whose colours are greener. So I prefer the 8A's colours, but in terms of detail, it's a clear win for the 10 Pro. This is another interesting comparison because I pointed out that with the 10 Pro's main lens, it makes the light look very dark, which I concluded was a fault with the 10 Pro's processing, but its wide-angle lens seems to do a better job, and it makes it look more like it does in reality, like a big glowy light. The 8A maybe resolves more detail on the light here, but overall the image just looks much nicer on the 10 Pro just because there's a lot less grain. Now the weird thing I'm spotting here is that the 10 Pro doesn't seem to have any more detail than the 8A does in this example. It just has a lot less grain. Can't make out any details here that aren't present here. So yeah, a win to the 10 Pro, although with the correct processing I think the 8A could come close here. Now in an ultra low light example, and the 10 Pro produces a really good image, whereas the 8A's is really falling off a cliff. It's even got these weird black dots here. The person walking along is blurrier in the 8A example. You can't even really tell it's a person, but here it very clearly is. And there's a fish or something next to them here. Don't know what that is. But again, I'm not sure the 10 Pro is producing that many more details. Everything's just a smooth blob. But it's better than this grainy blob that the 8A is producing. And you can almost make out the writing on this bin here, which just can't hear. So again, I'd say that the 10 Pro is a much better result, although it seems to be down to the processing rather than the amount of detail that the camera is detecting. And this last example was in super low light, and I mean I couldn't see this with my own eyes, so both cameras here are giving me super sensor vision, but the 8A makes my lawn look like a green blob, whereas the 10 Pro actually looks like a grass lawn. So much more detail. I mean, it's not even comparable. The 10 Pro is just much better at resolving these ultra low light examples. It looks like a lawn, whilst this just could be anything. Could be an AI generated blob. Now we move on to zoom capabilities, and this is where the 10 Pro should pull ahead once we get to 5x zoom, but at 2x zoom they should be quite evenly matched given the number of megapixels their main camera has. Let's have a look. The 8A seems to have a slight advantage in terms of sharpness on text. There's maybe a bit more detail on the 10 Pro's example on the wall here. The tree looks a little bit blobbier on the 8A, so it's you win some, you lose some. They both result in still quite an acceptable image, but the 10 Pro does have a tendency to over sharpen, whereas the 8A just accepts its fate and just kind of blobs details that it isn't sure about. Uh-oh, 10 Pro can't do these lines while the 8A is doing it just fine. So I think at 2x zoom, maybe the 8A has an advantage in areas, because it is a 64 megapixel lens compared with just 50. Moving up to 4x zoom, and the 10 Pro should have a trick up its sleeve. Let's zoom in and see if it can achieve it. Yes, it's definitely achieving something here, because now the 10 Pro is much clearer than the 8A. And I've investigated this in the past and have concluded that at like 4x zoom level, the 10 Pro can overlay its zoom sensor over the middle of the image, which means that the middle should result in a clearer image than the 8A is, which it clearly is here. But around the sides, the quality might drop off and we might get something a little bit more similar to the 8A in terms of quality. No, the 10 Pro is still better. So I don't know how the 10 Pro is achieving a better result even when it's not using its telephoto lens, but it is, and the image looks much better on the 10 Pro overall. And in this last comparison, it's 8x zoom, which is the 8A's maximum zoom level. And for good reason, because the quality is pretty shocking. These trees are just out of focus blobs, whereas the telephoto lens on the 10 Pro is doing a beautiful job still. Look at the amount of detail. And on the wall here, and on the sign, look, you can read the whole thing here. Good luck on the 8A. This is all totally in focus and it's resolving all the lines and it's all looking very nice on the 10 Pro still. The 10 Pro's zoom is good enough that it gives me superhuman vision. There are details here that I would not be able to make out with my own eyes. So yeah, this is what you're really paying for with a premium phone these days. You're paying for zoom capability, and the 8A simply has nothing in this regard. It's not unexpected, but it is nice to see just how much better the 10 Pro zoom is than the 8A without a zoom lens. This is a 2x zoom example, and I would consider this to be a best case scenario for the 8A, where it's got a lot of light to play with, and with its higher megapixel sensor, I wouldn't be surprised if the results were slightly better on this camera than with the 10 Pros. I'd say that 10 Pros is maybe a little bit blobbier than the 8As, especially along straight line. Oh no, I'd say that the 8A very slightly wins out here. Now 4x zoom, and this is why I'd expect the 10 Pro to pull ahead because of its telephoto lens, and yeah, it's definitely pulling ahead. It's getting detail on surfaces which just don't have any here. So the 8A is still very good at making nice smooth lines and clear-cut corners, but if you look at the surfaces themselves, they just have no detail or texture to them. I can't say the 10 Pro is particularly good. Oh yeah, it is much better. Look at the water. Yeah, the 10 Pro is definitely utilising its zoom lens here. But I've got to say, I am impressed by how well the 8A holds up, given that it doesn't have a zoom lens to use. But the 8x zoom is a bloodbath for the 8A. Can't read the writing, can read the writing. Can't read the writing, can read the writing. Oh look, lots of details on the walls. No details on the walls. You can even make out the design on this glass thing here. No such hope here. I'll just move on, because honestly, 8A is just, it sucks ass at this sort of zoom level. Another 2x example, I won't beat about the bush here. Again, the 8A resolves straight lines better than the 10 Pro can for whatever reason. So overall, I'd probably give the win to the 8A here for a 2x zoom. Yeah, look at that. 8A does much better than the 10 Pro does here. You can make out lots of artifacts in the sea as well, which the 8A does have, but fewer and they're less obvious in my opinion. 4x zoom now, and if we zoom in on the lines, 10 Pro is now doing a much better job because it's using the zoom lens. I'm curious to know where the zoom lens kicks in though, because if we go around the outside of the image, yeah, you'll see there's a blobby mess, and then it switches to the telephoto. Here, there's the line. High quality, low quality. But this is what surprises me, because around the outside of the image, it should still be as low quality as the 8A is, and yet for some reason the 10 Pro is still resolving more details. So I imagine it's upscaling more based on the details in the telephoto image, and it's kind of applying the same sort of textures to the surrounding areas to try and mask the fact that it's much lower in resolution. Whatever it's doing, the 10 Pro's result is much nicer. It's doing a really good job of combining two images together to produce the best of both worlds. Yeah, clear win for the 10 Pro here. And last is the 8x zoom. Still surprisingly readable on the 8A, but the rest of it is a blurry mess, while this is still quite an acceptable looking image. You can see with your own eyes what needs to be seen. But is it worth £1,000? You might recognise this image. I compared 1x zoom levels in my previous video and gave the win to the 8A, which for some reason was much more detailed than the 10 Pro was here. But at 2x zoom, how do they fare? Well, for some reason the 8A is still winning here, producing more detail than the 10 Pro can. Don't ask me why, I'm not even going to bother speculating. Comparing 4x zoom levels now, and the 10 Pro is, I think, starting to win. It all looks very unnatural, it looks like a watercolour of some sort, but there's definitely a lot more detail here than there is there. I'm not sure that's how the guy's face looks, but yeah, definitely better overall. I'm not sure either are that usable an image. We're now in ultra low light examples here. The 10 Pro clearly wins, but here's the dilemma I have. The 10 Pro might be better at zooming in low light, but if the result is still not worth keeping, does it matter? Because this is better than that, but I still don't like this. This doesn't look like a picture, it looks like a collage of blobs. And one last example, but the same outcome. 10 Pro is clearer, but just looks like a blob. Now for something completely different. Nature, or at the very least the back of a sewage work somewhere. So, is the 8A still sharper than the 10 Pro here? I'd say it's slightly more detailed. The 10 Pro again just looks a little bit over sharpened with its main sensor zoomed in a bit. It just looks more natural than this. Let's move on to 4x zoom. 4x zoom, 10 Pro gets the advantage. Although strangely, the extra detail only seems to be in the very middle of this image, and then there's some weird blurry bit down here where it isn't high detail, and this bit for some reason is high detailed again. Wait, what's going on here? It's almost like it's really struggling to layer one image on top of the other, so it's almost like a patchwork where some bits kind of look more detailed, but distractingly so. It's right on the cusp of not being able to do it. So I guess this is an example of where overlaying the telephoto result kind of goes a bit wrong. The result still looks better, but it's inconsistent. Especially there. And the 8x result, now it's moved right over to the telephoto. It all looks quite a bit better than the 8A does. Yep, win to the 10 Pro, obviously. After that result, I was interested to see if it would mess up anywhere else as well. So this is another example. 2x zoom. I think the win kind of goes to the 8A again. It just seems better at 2x zoom. 10 Pro looks sharper, but look at this, jagged lines. Whereas the 8A does a beautiful job of smoothing it all out. I would say, yeah, it's a win to the 8A again here. Provided it all goes right, the 10 Pro should win at the 4x zoom, and sure enough it does. It's not a clear-cut win though. I still think that's a bit of a messy result. It's clearly overlaying two images over each other, and the result is a little bit distracting. But for the most part, it's done a very good job, and it definitely looks a lot better. But you can still make out, this is interesting, you can still make out the low resolution version underneath. It's almost like it's applying the more detailed version as like a patterned layer on top of the original image, rather than replacing it entirely. And of course, the 8x zoom is a clear-cut win to the 10 Pro. The 8A just fails miserably at this sort of zoom level, as to be expected. So I'm aware I've been comparing 2x zoom where the 8A always wins, and then 4x zoom where the 10 Pro always wins. What about 3x zoom? It's a win to the 10 Pro. Just looks better. So every time the 10 Pro wins in zoom comparisons, I assume that it's the telephoto lens kicking in some way. Yeah, it's definitely a lot better on the 10 Pro. I'd say that's almost like a perfect looking image. When 3x zoom is, I would have thought, the weak spot where they're halfway between the two lenses. Here's another 3x zoom, just to see how it does. Look, you can see the cutoff. You can see exactly where it goes from the low resolution result to the high. Not that it's a bad thing. I'd rather have this higher quality thing than just to look low, but overall I'm quite impressed with the 10 Pro's fusion technology, where they fuse two different images together. Especially what with how the benefits seem to extend beyond the telephoto area. Like, even this looks better than the 8A, even though this is not using the zoom lens. This is just using the normal one. I decided to do a quick little macro comparison just because, and I'm doing this slightly differently. All these three pictures are taken using the Pixel 10 Pro. This is the wide-angle lens, this is the main one, and this is the telephoto. Overall, I'd say the best one for taking macro is the main lens. You can see just how much detail I've got on this tiny little flower, although it only takes a small cross-section of the flower in focus because it's close up. The macro also does a surprisingly good job actually, but overall I felt like I could get closer with the main lens. Using the telephoto, I actually had to get back quite a long way, and then I used something like 9x zoom because it kept jumping back to the main lens below 9x zoom, even though it's a very bright image. The result is still really good, but I still think the main camera is better. The 10 Pro is very good at taking macro images no matter which of its lenses you use. The 8A, on the other hand, is not so good. Now, the wide angle is totally useless, you can't get close to it at all. I moved a long way back for this example, and even still, it wasn't in focus, so you can forget about that. The main lens is not too bad, still not as good as the 10 Pro at getting up really close, but it's alright. And the zoom lens, this was at like 3x zoom level, and it still looks pretty good in my opinion. It's not like zooming in adds any more detail, but I imagine it would make more of it in focus because it's further away. I wanted to test panoramas, but they're not directly comparable because the 8A does it this standard sliding way, where you just have to gradually move your phone around to take the image as far as you like. Whereas the 10 Pro forces you to line up dots, and it takes snaps every time you do that. And then it attempts to piece the image together from that, which I think is a bit less flexible and arguably harder to use. Now, Google made a big song and dance about how the Pixel 9 improved panoramas by giving it all proper HDR and stuff. And I will say, yes, this new method of taking panoramas is a lot more detailed than the standard sliding method is. The panoramas you can take now are astoundingly high-res, vibrant in colour, and beautiful looking. Put it simply, if I was trying to take a picture of a beautiful vista and I only had my Pixel 8A with me, then I'd be sad, because I'd know I'd be missing out on so much potential beauty. But I don't think the 10 Pro can take all of the credit here, for I remember a time long ago when Pixel phones offered both options of taking panoramas. And this dot connecting exercise was called Photosphere, and it was far more flexible than it was here because you could take pictures vertically as well and piece them all together into a huge 360-degree image and so on. So I'd be curious to know what the 8A could have done had it had access to this same Photosphere option. But since it doesn't, the Pixel 10 wins the panoramas by a wide margin. Straight off the bat, we see that the 8A has more vertical scope, more of the sky, more of the ground, so it might be able to cover more of a scene than the 10 Pro does. But if we zoom in, the tables turn. Yeah, there is so much detail here. And the file sizes reflect this. This is like 14 megabytes versus the 8A's 6. But what you get is just vastly superior. And more vivid colours as well, which was one of the things they did promote with the Pixel 9. When they showed this new panorama feature, there really is no comparison between them. And the 8A's panoramas are already very good, just not as good. You can even make out the ski slope. Incredible. Here's a previous unsuccessful panorama that I took, and the reason it's unsuccessful is because the Pixel 10 Pro is all slightly out of focus, and I think it's because I started pointing at this bush, which is in the foreground, so it focuses on the bush, then keeps that same focus for the rest of the shot. So you'll notice that everything is, it's still a lot more detailed than this, but it's all out of focus. When the other panorama I showed was crystal clear. But even when it is out of focus like this, it's still superior to this. But it does make me question the new panorama system, if it could be tricked. On to the conclusion. Over a lot of comparisons, I am happy to report that there are a few reliable results that came out of all my testing. With the wide angle, despite being just a 13 megapixel lens, the camera on the 8A holds up perfectly well against the 10 Pro, until you get to extremely low light examples, and then it grains up and blobs up and becomes quite unusable much sooner. But what can I say? It'll hold up under most situations where you'd want to use a wide angle lens. And when it comes to the zoom, the 8A's 2x zoom is remarkably competitive, and I'd say even wins against the 10 Pro's 2x zoom. Then as we extend beyond that, the 10 Pro's telephoto lens begins to give it the advantage, and in situations where it kicks in, it utterly pwns the 8A in terms of clarity. You do not see this improved fusion result in the preview when you're taking the image. It could look horribly fuzzy and grainy as you're taking the picture on the 10 Pro, and it's only when you view the image back that you get to see the higher res, fusion enhanced image. The 10 Pro also wins for panoramas and macro shots, making it all round an extremely versatile phone with far fewer weaknesses than the 8A has. But when conditions are optimal, I do sometimes prefer the 8A's image quality, which makes me question where the base Pixel 10 will land in all these areas. Is it very similar to the 8A but with an extra telephoto lens? Or has every aspect of the camera been improved thanks to software support? I'm asking these questions because I don't have the answers, and I sure as hell am not buying another phone just to get to the bottom of this. So someone else, please, make a decent camera comparison between these phones. I can't believe how YouTube can be so full of camera reviews, yet so devoid of camera details. Please, get your act together, phone YouTubers. Pixel 10 versus Pixel 10 Pro camera comparison videos, with examples. Thanks.